Hello, I am Luke Hewitt, and the purpose of this screencast is to assess what elements are needed to create a successful video game remake through examining well-known examples. I shall begin by defining a remake and then move on to a comparative analysis of Resident Evil, Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary, and Flashback with their original releases. This will prove useful in showing differences with design and gameplay elements. Further analysis of how successful each game was when considering player and critical reviews will help to conclude what defines an acclaimed remake. To fully understand what elements are used to craft a successful remake, it must first be defined. It could simply be defined as a newer version of previous work within the same medium. However, this is quite a broad definition and could encompass reboots and remasters. Martin Robinson uses the term interchangeably in his article for Eurogamer. However, Amir Al-Assa treats the terms as two separate definitions, but admits that the ground between remaster and remake is often fuzzier than we initially imagine. In this, I agree with Al-Assa, and these mediums must be explored in order to understand how the definition of a remake differs from them. Reboots take an established franchise and introduce a new timeline or storyline that purposely disregards the previously established history of the series. Doom would fit well into this definition as it shares elements with the established series such as the in-game enemies, which use the original game's designs as a basis for their redesigns. The setting of Mars and the UAC base are also reused as this has become synonymous with Doom and fans expect it. However, the history of the main character has changed from a lone marine battling the forces of hell to survive. Instead, the player character is the Doomslayer, a sole surviving knight who fights for leagues of hell. The overall gameplay and context of the game are similar, but the backstory differs greatly to the point where they don't acknowledge each other. Remasters are quite different to both, as they are essentially the exact same game, using the original assets and textures, but displaying them at a higher resolution with visual tweaks added to them. Dishonored Definitive Edition is defined as a remaster due to its assets, textures, and story being identical to the original release. The game only offers a new resolution and all its DLC included. However, games like BioShock Remastered don't fit into this definition completely, as it takes a ground-up approach with models clearly boasting significantly more detail. Some of the assets were remade to a modern standard whilst the core game and its code remain unchanged. From this, we can start to identify what a game remake is and isn't. Firstly, Vervis states that remakes are pieces of media where plots and settings are copied. However, other elements like the art and design should have similarities to the original, while refining them into something new and exciting. Therefore, a simple increase in resolution cannot be defined as a remake. If a developer introduces newly created materials such as new assets, soundtracks, voice acting,
Don't open that door!
You don't want to go back out there.
and new gameplay, then the game becomes a remake. Resident Evil was created by Capcom and released in 1996 for the Sony PlayStation. It began as a remake of an earlier Capcom game, the 1989 NES title, Sweet Home. The plot followed a group of specially trained police officers as they explored a mansion that had been overrun with zombies and creatures that had been created in a lab hidden underneath the mansion. The game's director, Shinji Mikami, was chosen because he admitted to being scared of horror. As the producer Fujiwara stated, "You can't make a horror game if you don't have any fear." The game would have players explore the mansion where they would encounter puzzles and find various items. Items were limited, which increased the game's difficulty as the player would have to choose whether to engage in combat with limited supplies or try to evade enemies. Resident Evil's remake fulfills the criteria of a remake, as everything about the game was recreated from new assets, a new soundtrack and voice acting, to new enemies and story elements that weren't present in the original. Mechanics introduced in later games were also implemented into the remake, such as the quick turn that was introduced in Resident Evil 3. Completely new mechanics were introduced in order to fit with the newly introduced enemies. An example of this is the Crimson Head, a quicker and more powerful variant of a zombie that appears if the enemy bodies aren't burnt. Existing puzzles were rearranged or changed, with other new puzzles introduced, such as the mask puzzle. Because of the extensive treatment to the game, it is recognised as a full remake. Reviews of the time praised most of the added elements of the game as well as most of the reworked features. It is believed that the remake surpasses the original as it improves upon the tension and atmosphere built by the original through its graphics and gameplay. An example of this would be in this scene, where in the original a Cerberus would jump through the window on the player's first pass. However, in the remake, the window only cracks on the first pass and the Cerberus attacks on the second pass, drawing out the anticipation and tension and fooling returning players and making the experience feel fresh. Resident Evil is a good remake because it changes the formula of the original but does not change its vision. This is good for players returning to the game as it does not feel repetitive and gives the player more on top of the original. There are new puzzles and areas to explore, keeping the game from being just a repeat of its predecessor. Bungie originally created Halo as an RTS for the Mac, but later changed it to a third-person action game. However, the game eventually became a launch title for the Xbox after Bungie was bought by Microsoft in 2000. Halo is one of the largest games in its genre and has gone on to inspire books and other merchandise. It is therefore of little surprise that it should warrant a remake. This remake was handled by 343 Industries rather than Bungie. This is different to Resident Evil, which was made both times by Capcom and headed by McCartney. This could be the reason why there are more changes to the story in Resident Evil than in Halo, as the original director would have felt a lot more confident making narrative changes. Where possible, the developers tried to draw on assets from Halo 3 and Halo Reach. Halo is a different kind of remake to Resident Evil's remake, as the Anniversary Edition enables you to switch between the original and the new version as you are playing. In order for this to be a feature, they sacrificed being able to change anything apart from the assets and soundtrack. This feature allows the player to truly see the difference between them as they are playing. Although IGN's Stephen Hooper calls the game a remake, the game actually sits closer to a remaster and describes itself as such on its page on the Microsoft Store. This is in part due to the technical demands of remaining in the same game engine, and also because they wanted to keep it so close to the original that they didn't really try to change anything. Despite 343 Industries trying to stay as close to the original as possible, shifts in detail and colour levels leads to a mood change from the original game, which isn't typical of most remasters. Overall, it is a weaker remake than Resident Evil, despite the interesting ability to switch between versions on the go. Flashback is a game by Delphine Software International. They were notable for their cinematic games such as Another World, which has been noted as one of the most visionary and memorable games of its time. Flashback stands out as although the remake was developed by a different games company to the original, it retains the same designer, Paul Cuisset. The original was a 2D platformer with rotoscoping, a technique where someone draws an animation over a real-life reference image to get a more realistic motion. In contrast, the remake was remade from the ground up in 2.5D, using technology which wasn't available during the days of the original. They included new features such as a skill system and included voice acting where the original only had written dialogue. The original received brilliant reviews for its amazing graphics and cinematic qualities. The remake did not receive the same level of acclaim, with reviews labelling it as a disappointing and generic platformer, which did little to stand up to the other games of the genre and lost the charm of the original. Overall, Flashback is a remake as it deliberately tries to improve upon the original and adds more new features such as a skill system, 2.5D graphics with modern rendering techniques, voice acting, and old gameplay sequences like side quests. However, this contrasts too deeply with the original cinematic vision of the game, and does not innovate enough to make it stand out from other similar games of the time to encourage new players. Whilst it succeeds in creating a sense of nostalgia for the original in older players, it also fails to create a faithful representation of the original that could have been well received by returning players. Overall, the remake with the best visual improvement is Resident Evil. This is especially surprising because although the remake is only on a console one generation ahead of the original, the graphics were improved to look 2 generations ahead, with reviews calling some assets photorealistic. Flashback also shows great visual improvement and the ability to keep a similar aesthetic to the original, and was praised for this in reviews. This is in part due to 20 years elapsing between the original and the remake, and also because of switching from 2D gameplay to 2.5D, which allows a more dynamic viewing experience with faster pacing. However, Resident Evil is more faithful to the original with its new visuals and the atmosphere they helped to create. For this reason, I believe it to be superior to Flashback. In contrast, Halo's visual improvement ruins the original mood of the game, as well as losing some of the more impressive aspects displayed in the original. So whilst it is more detailed, it loses the spirit of its predecessor. Resident Evil also focused most on improving the gameplay through introducing aspects of the newer games and new enemies and puzzles. In contrast, Halo puts little in the way of gameplay changes into their game. Despite this, Halo is a good remake for what it sets out to achieve, which is to overhaul the visuals for a new generation of gamers. Reviews support this, calling it mesmerizing, especially when compared to the original. In this screencast, I have defined a remake and how it differs from a remaster and a reboot. I then explored 3 different remakes in Halo, Resident Evil, and Flashback. I looked at the changes that were made when the games were remade before comparing them in terms of gameplay and visuals. Overall, I found Resident Evil to be the best remake because Mikami did not shy away from making changes to the original, but kept the game's look and feel in a homage that was good for new and old players alike. Flashback was a worse remake, although this could mostly be down to the buggy hand-holding nature of the game. This suggests that to be a successful remake, developers must remain faithful to the original vision, but not be afraid to make changes that will give the game a fresh outlook. In the future, this study could be expanded through looking at more remakes such as Oddworld New and Tasty and Bionic Commando, and perhaps extending the same methodology to remasters and reimaginings could offer a more in-depth look at what common factors make these re-releases successful. It was unexpected that Flashback would be the worst remake because the original game had a strong and interesting film background that could have been expanded on well in its remaster. This study was difficult because of the lack of media that existed already surrounding defining a game remake. Many articles are happy to use terms such as remake and remaster interchangeably, which made finding example definitions hard even when looking at transmedia definitions. Thank you for watching my screencast.